This is a story about a broken promise, one made on paper, signed at Fort Laramie, and quietly abandoned the moment gold made it inconvenient. It is a story from the Old West that most accounts compress into a single battle. But the truth runs longer and slower than that, like a river working its way through stone. Before the Black Hills became a symbol of gold and war, they stood inside a promise made by the United States, and that promise would not survive the pressure that followed Custer's confirmation of gold in 1874. But the story begins earlier than any treaty. It begins with the land itself. In the northern reaches of what is now South Dakota, a range of hills rises out of the surrounding plains with a kind of quiet authority. From a distance, the pine-covered slopes appear dark against the sky, darker than the grasslands stretching away in every direction, and that contrast is where the name comes from. The Lakota called them Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Up close, the hills open into something more layered. Ponderosa pines grow thick along the ridges, their bark warm and reddish in afternoon light, the air carrying the dry, clean scent of resin. Streams move through the valleys between exposed limestone and granite, cold and clear, running down through grassy margins where game had always gathered. The stone itself breaks in useful ways. Chert and flint lie along the slopes, materials that people worked into tools for as long as anyone had moved through this part of the continent. This was not empty country. That distinction matters, because the story of what happened to the Black Hills after 1868 has sometimes been told as if the land were simply waiting to be found, waiting to be opened, waiting to become something. It was already something. The hills and the broader plains surrounding them had sustained human life for generations before a single American soldier or settler arrived anywhere near the northern plains. Archaeological traces survive in the ground and on the surface. Stone teepee rings still mark places where communities stopped, stayed, and sheltered. Worked chert confirms tool production, people selecting, shaping, and using what the hills provided. These traces do not carry precise dates or singular cultural attributions, but they are evidence of something real, long, repeated, purposeful use of this landscape. For Lakota communities by the mid-19th century, the Black Hills carried meaning that was both material and something harder to reduce to practical terms. The surrounding country, the bison ranges, the river systems, the wide grasslands of the northern plains, supplied what daily life required. Bison provided food, hide for shelter and clothing, bone for tools, sinew for bowstrings, fat for fuel. The hills themselves held timber, stone, and water, but the relationship to this landscape was not purely a question of resources. The National Park Service describes the Black Hills as sacred Lakota ground. Oral traditions, ceremonial places, vision quests, seasonal gatherings, and prayer are documented aspects of indigenous relationships with the broader hills region. Sacred places in the surrounding country were not incidental to Lakota life. They were woven into it. The hills were not simply where the Lakota lived. They were part of how the Lakota understood themselves and their place in the world. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because what followed in the 1870s was not merely a land dispute in a narrow legal sense. What was being pressured, purchased, and eventually seized was a landscape that held that kind of significance, the kind that does not translate easily into rental agreements or dollar amounts per acre. Other indigenous peoples had older and continuing connections to the wider region as well. The Black Hills and the Northern Plains were not the exclusive territory of a single nation when the Lakota rose to prominence there, and the history of the land goes deeper than any single people's story. But by the time the United States government sat down at Fort Laramie in 1868 to negotiate the terms of a new peace, it was Lakota power and Lakota resistance that had forced that negotiation. And it was Lakota communities whose relationship to the Black Hills would sit at the center of the agreement they were about to sign. The hills stood in the early morning light, the way they had stood through every season anyone in the region could remember. Pine and stone, cold water, dry grass bending at the edges of the meadows, the distant movement of animals across the slopes. A teepee ring on a hillside, worn smooth by weather, visible against the darker earth. Nothing in the landscape itself announced what was coming. Nothing in the pine scent or the sound of the stream suggested that within a generation, this ground would become the center of a broken promise, a gold rush, and a war. That promise would be made at Fort Laramie in the spring of 1868, at the end of a conflict that had already cost both sides more than either had anticipated. To understand what was being promised and what it meant to break it, it helps to understand the struggle that made the treaty necessary in the first place. The road was the problem. Before the gold, before the treaty, before any formal promise was written down and signed, there was a road, and the road was why the war happened. In the years following the Civil War, the United States was moving. Settlers and miners were pushing toward Montana territory, drawn by gold strikes in the mountains to the northwest, and the most direct path cut straight through the heart of the Powder River country, through grasslands and river valleys that Lakota and allied communities had long used for hunting, movement, and winter camps. The route became known as the Bozeman Trail, named for the man who had mapped and promoted it, and by the mid-1860s, federal authorities were pressing ahead with plans to fortify and protect it. That meant forts. Military posts rose along the trail: Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, timber structures set down in country that was not empty and not unclaimed. The Army's presence was straightforward in its purpose: to keep the road open, to protect wagon trains moving through, and to assert federal authority over routes that Washington considered essential for Western expansion. The Lakota and their Cheyenne allies considered those forts an invasion. What followed was not a single battle or a brief skirmish along the trail. It was a sustained conflict, a war, though Washington was slow to use that word at the time, fought across the Powder River country between roughly 1866 and 1868. History records it as Red Cloud's War, named for the Oglala Lakota leader whose influence and coordination helped shape resistance across a wide stretch of the northern plains. Red Cloud himself was a careful, patient leader, and the conflict he helped organize was less a series of dramatic pitched engagements than a relentless pressure, parties cutting off supply lines, ambushes along the trail, attacks on woodcutting details that ventured out from the forts. The terrain worked in favor of those who knew it. The Powder River country is open in ways that deceive the eye. Wide grasslands running between ranges of hills with long sight lines and equally long approaches. Wagon roads and military columns moved through it slowly, dependent on predictable routes. The communities who hunted that country had spent generations reading its distances and its seasonal rhythms, and they used that knowledge to keep the trail dangerous, the forts isolated, and the Army's position increasingly uncomfortable. One engagement from December 1866 illustrated the shape of the conflict clearly. A column from Fort Phil Kearny was drawn away from the post in pursuit of a decoy party, and was then engaged and overwhelmed in the surrounding terrain. The engagement, sometimes called the Fetterman Fight, after the officer who led the column, resulted in the loss of the entire force, more than 80 soldiers. It was one of the most significant setbacks the U.S. Army had suffered on the northern plains, and it made certain that Washington could not simply press forward along the Bozeman Trail without cost. By 1868, the calculation in Washington had shifted. The forts had failed to secure the trail in any meaningful sense. The route remained dangerous. The Army's presence had generated sustained resistance rather than ending it, and the costs, in men, in materiel, in political credibility, had risen beyond what the situation could justify. Alternatives to the Bozeman Trail were being developed further south and west, routes that bypassed the contested Powder River country entirely. The trail's strategic value was shrinking at the same time that its military defense was proving difficult to sustain. And so, in a turn that would have seemed improbable just 2 years earlier, the United States agreed to negotiate, not from a position of victory, not after defeating the resistance that had kept the trail closed and the forts under pressure. Washington came to the table having agreed, in effect, to give up what it had tried to hold by force. The settlement required the United States to abandon the military posts along the Bozeman Trail, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, and to close the road itself through the unceded country north of the North Platte River. Those posts were evacuated and, in some accounts, burned by Lakota warriors shortly after the soldiers left, a visible symbol of what the negotiation had actually produced. This matters for understanding what came later. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was not a gift extended by a confident federal government to a people it had subdued. It was a settlement that followed a conflict the United States had not won, negotiated under conditions that required concrete concessions, the abandonment of forts, the closure of a road, in exchange for the peace Washington needed on the northern plains. The Lakota who came to Fort Laramie in the spring of 1868 came as communities that had forced those concessions. The document they were about to sign reflected that reality, at least on paper. Along the Powder River country, the forts went quiet. The wind moved across the grasslands the way it always had, carrying dust and dry grass smell past the abandoned timber walls, through the empty parade grounds, out toward the long distances where wagon tracks were already beginning to fade back into the plain. The road was closing. Something else was opening. That something else was a treaty, a formal written promise, made at the old fort on the Laramie River, that was supposed to settle the question of the northern plains for good. At Fort Laramie, that promise took shape in a place already familiar with movement. The fort stood near the river systems of the Laramie and the North Platte, where water, trails, trade, and military traffic had crossed for years. Long before it became a symbol of treaty-making, Fort Laramie had served as a trading center. Later, it became a United States military post, part of the growing federal presence on the plains. By 1868, its weathered buildings looked out across a landscape that had carried traders, soldiers, emigrants, hunters, and native communities through very different kinds of journeys. The negotiations did not unfold inside some distant government chamber. Delegations gathered in the Fort Laramie area, across the Laramie River from the fort itself. Horses stood nearby. Canvas moved in the dry air. The river continued past the gathering while commissioners, interpreters, chiefs, headmen, and witnesses worked through an agreement meant to replace years of fighting with written terms. April 29, 1868, became the core date attached to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, though the process was not completed in one single moment. Different Lakota bands signed at different times during that year. The surviving treaty text preserves the formal structure of the occasion in lists of names: federal commissioners, chiefs, headmen, interpreters, and witnesses. On the page, the document has the orderly appearance of an agreement that could make a complicated frontier understandable. but its importance lay less in the ceremony than in what the United States actually promised. Article 2 established what became known as the Great Sioux Reservation. The language was unusually strong. The reservation was set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians covered by the treaty. Those words mattered. They did not merely describe an area where native communities might be allowed to remain for the time being. They described a protected territorial arrangement. The United States also agreed that unauthorized people would not be permitted to pass over the reservation, settle upon it, or reside within it. Roads, settlers, prospectors, and other forms of private expansion were therefore not separate from the treaty. They were part of the problem the treaty was designed to regulate. That made the agreement deeply connected to the world of the western frontier. It concerned who could travel through certain places, who could build there, who could live there, where federal authority stopped, where native occupation was supposed to be protected, and what would happen when the restless movement of the American West pressed against those limits again. The treaty was not only about keeping outsiders away, it also tried to reshape life inside the reservation. Its provisions encouraged permanent settlement and farming. They called for schools and teachers. They included livestock and agricultural tools, along with cattle and oxen. There were provisions for flour and meat, clothing, blacksmiths, farmers, and other personnel connected to the federal agency system. These details can seem ordinary beside the larger language of land and sovereignty. A sack of flour, an agricultural implement, a teacher, a blacksmith, a herd of cattle. Yet together, they reveal something important about the settlement. Washington was promising territorial protection while also encouraging a major transformation in how the people covered by the treaty would live. The federal vision pointed toward fixed residence, farming, schooling, livestock raising, and increasing reliance on government agencies and supplies. That was very different from simply drawing a boundary around existing life and leaving everything within it untouched. So the treaty carried two movements at once. One movement pulled federal troops and roads back from contested country. The other tried to draw native communities toward a more settled, supervised, agency-centered future. For the moment, those tensions could remain on paper. The strongest immediate promise was still territorial. The United States had agreed that a defined reservation would be protected for the people covered by the treaty, and that unauthorized settlement and passage would be restricted. After the fighting along the Bozeman Trail, that was not an abstract sentence. It addressed the very forces that had helped produce the conflict in the first place. Roads entering native country, military posts defending them, and outsiders moving through land whose control had never been peacefully settled. Imagine the treaty pages there near the river. Ink drying, paper lifting slightly in the plain's air, the fort on one side of the water, delegations gathered on the other, horses shifting beyond the formal meeting space. Everything about the scene suggested an attempt to make boundaries firm. Words would replace forts. Signatures would replace military pressure. A written agreement would define where settlement could and could not go. At least, that was the expectation the document created. And for the story of the Black Hills, Article 2 would become the essential point. The later dispute was not simply about a region that native people valued and newcomers wanted. It was about land that had been placed inside a formal reservation, protected by explicit federal language. That distinction would matter enormously once gold entered the story. But before reaching the miners, the military expeditions, or the newspaper reports that would make the Black Hills famous across the country, the treaty map itself has to be understood. The Great Sioux Reservation was not the same thing as every part of the northern plains used by Lakota communities. Nor did the treaty reduce all native movement outside the reservation to trespass or defiance. It created different territorial categories, with different rules attached to them. Some land lay inside the formal reservation. Other country remained outside it while still carrying treaty-recognized protections connected to hunting and movement. And somewhere inside that legal geography stood the Black Hills. The next question, then, is a simple one with consequences that would reach far beyond the treaty field at Fort Laramie. Exactly what land had the United States promised to protect? To answer that question, it helps to imagine the treaty not as a page of legal language, but as a map laid out across a table. At the center was the Great Sioux Reservation. Its boundaries ran across an enormous section of the northern plains. To the east stood the Missouri River. To the south, the northern boundary of Nebraska. To the north, the 46th parallel. To the west, the 104th meridian. The treaty also included additional existing reservations east of the Missouri. Within that formal reservation lay the Black Hills. The point needs to remain clear, because later events would depend on it. The Black Hills were not merely somewhere near treaty country. They were inside the Great Sioux Reservation, recognized by the Agreement of 1868. On a map, the distinction is easy to see. Rivers become lines. Latitude and longitude become borders. A wooded mountain region can be placed within a larger shape and understood in a glance. On the ground, the country was far more expansive. The Missouri ran broad and steady to the east. Far to the west, the land rose toward the Black Hills, and then beyond them into the wider northern plains. Between those points stretched grasslands, river valleys, hunting country, and routes that had never depended on survey lines for their meaning. The treaty tried to impose several legal categories across that landscape. The reservation was one of them. Another was what Article 16 called unceded Indian territory. This country lay north of the North Platte River and east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains. It was not described in the treaty as part of the formal reservation, but neither was it simply opened to white settlement. Article 16 said white settlers could not occupy that unceded territory. They also could not pass through it without indigenous consent. That created an important second layer on the treaty map. The reservation had one legal status. The unceded country had another. Both carried protections, but they were not the same protections, and the lands were not legally identical. There was also movement between these spaces. The Fort Laramie Treaty did not reduce Lakota life to permanent residence inside one fixed boundary. Article 11 preserved specified hunting rights outside the reservation. It recognized a right to hunt north of the North Platte River and along the Republican Fork, while buffalo remained there in numbers sufficient to justify the chase. That mattered, because hunting was not a minor activity added to reservation life. It remained tied to food, movement, seasonal decisions, and the wider economy of the plains. So a Lakota family beyond the formal reservation line was not automatically outside the treaty's protection. A hunting party north of the North Platte was not necessarily trespassing. A camp in treaty-recognized hunting country could exist within rights that the United States had explicitly acknowledged in 1868. This is one of the places where later retellings can become misleading if the map is made too simple. There was the Great Sioux Reservation. There was unceded Indian territory. There were specified hunting rights beyond the reservation. And surrounding all of those formal categories was a much larger indigenous landscape, shaped by travel, hunting, seasonal use, kinship, memory, and political relationships that no single federal map could fully contain. The treaty did not erase that older geography merely by drawing lines around parts of it. Instead, it placed federal legal language over a living landscape. That distinction would become important when Washington later began describing some Lakota communities outside reservation agencies as a political or military problem. Location alone did not tell the whole story. The treaty itself had preserved forms of movement beyond the reservation. But there was another provision hidden within the same document that would become just as important. Article 12 concerned the surrender of land held in common. Its language created a high threshold. Before any cession of commonly held reservation land could be valid against the people concerned, the agreement required the signatures of at least 3/4 of all adult male Indians occupying or interested in the reservation. 3/4. That requirement was not a decorative phrase. It was a safeguard written directly into the treaty. The government could not simply gather a small number of signatures and treat that as sufficient consent for the transfer of commonly held reservation land. For the moment, that provision may have seemed like one clause among many. Years later, it would become one of the clearest measures by which the transfer of the Black Hills could be judged. But in 1868, the map still represented a settlement that appeared to have structure. The formal reservation had its boundaries. The Black Hills stood inside them. The unceded country remained protected from white settlement and unauthorized passage. Hunting rights extended into specified lands beyond the reservation, and any future surrender of commonly held reservation land was supposed to require an extraordinary level of consent. Seen this way, the treaty was not simply a promise to leave one isolated piece of land alone. It was an attempt to regulate an entire geography of movement. Rivers mattered. Roads mattered. Hunting grounds mattered. Reservation lines mattered. Who could cross those lines mattered. And so did the question of who had the authority to give land away. If a paper map from 1868 were spread out now, the Black Hills would sit well within the territory whose status had been formally defined. Forested ridges and stone outcrops would appear only as marks inside a boundary, quiet on the page. Yet those hills were never simply one part of a legal diagram. For Lakota communities, their importance could not be measured only by acres, boundary lines, or what Washington might someday offer to pay for them. To understand why the later demand for the Black Hills met such resistance, the map has to be folded away for a moment. The story has to return to the land itself. Fold the map, and the Black Hills become something else entirely. The lines disappear first. The meridians, parallels, and reservation boundaries are gone. What remains is pine, stone, open grassland, moving water, game, weather, and the long presence of people who knew the country in ways no federal document could capture. For Lakota communities, the hills were not important for only one reason. They were not merely sacred ground, though they were sacred. They were not merely useful country, though they provided resources that supported daily life. They were not merely political territory, though control of the land carried obvious consequences for independence and movement. All of those meanings existed together. Across the broader Black Hills region, indigenous communities maintained relationships with places associated with prayer, ceremonies, vision quests, oral traditions, winter camps, and seasonal gatherings. These were not abstract ideas attached to a distant landscape. They were practices rooted in particular places, repeated through time, and carried through memory. A ridge could be more than high ground. A sheltered valley could be more than a convenient place to stop. A place used for prayer or ceremony could hold a meaning that could not be separated from the land itself. That spiritual geography matters because later federal efforts would increasingly treat the Black Hills as something that could be measured, priced, leased, purchased, or transferred. For many Lakota people, that was an entirely different way of understanding value. The material world of the hills was just as important. The larger region formed part of bison country, and bison remained central to life across the plains. They supplied food, but their importance extended far beyond meat. Hides could provide shelter and clothing. Other parts of the animal could become tools and useful objects. Bison also carried ceremonial importance. The surrounding landscape offered other resources as well. Stone could become material for tools. Water shaped movement and camps. Grassland supported animals. Forested country provided a different environment from the open plains around it. Seasonal changes altered where people traveled, where animals moved, and where shelter could be found. In the cold months, the physical character of the hills could matter in immediate ways. Morning air might settle sharply into the valleys. Smoke could rise from a small camp and drift among the trees. Horses shifted on frozen or dry ground. Nearby, stone and timber broke the endless openness of the plains. Nothing about such a scene suggests empty country. It suggests familiarity. It suggests repeated use. It suggests a landscape understood through experience rather than through survey lines. That is one reason the language often used for Western expansion can distort what was happening. Land, described by outsiders as undeveloped, could already be woven deeply into indigenous economic, social, political, and spiritual life. The Black Hills were a clear example. Their value did not suddenly begin when someone found something beneath the soil. Long before mining became the subject of newspaper stories, the country already supported systems of movement, subsistence, gathering, memory, and sacred practice. This did not mean every Lakota leader viewed every part of the hills in exactly the same way. Lakota communities were not one centralized political body speaking with a single voice on every question. Different bands, leaders, families, and communities could make different decisions and respond differently to changing circumstances. But that political diversity does not erase the wider importance of the Black Hills. If anything, it makes later events more understandable. Washington would eventually search for people who could negotiate over the land. Federal officials would try to turn the question into one of consent, signatures, and price. Yet the land being discussed did not exist only as property on paper. It was part of a larger world. That larger world included the bison herds moving through regional grasslands. It included winter camps. It included routes traveled between places known over generations. It included ceremonial locations. It included stories attached to the country. It included practical knowledge of water, animals, shelter, stone, and season. These things were not easily separated into neat categories. Food could carry ceremonial meaning. A hunting place could also be part of family memory. A landscape useful for winter shelter could also contain places approached with spiritual significance. The modern distinction between economic value and sacred value becomes too narrow when applied to such a relationship. The Black Hills could be both, and more. That is the deeper reason the treaty boundary mattered. When the United States recognized the hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, it was not protecting an abstract block of acreage that happened to contain forests and streams. The agreement covered country already filled with meaning. The legal promise rested over a landscape whose importance had developed long before the treaty itself. For a few years after 1868, that promise and that older landscape could exist beside one another with comparatively little outside pressure. The hills remained where they had always been. Pine-covered slopes rose above the surrounding plains. Streams continued through stone and grass. Bison remained central to the regional economy and way of life. Camps appeared and disappeared with movement and season. But beyond the reservation, another way of seeing the hills was beginning to grow. To outsiders looking west, the same country could suggest timber, grazing, agricultural possibility, and, most powerfully, mineral wealth. Rumors of gold and silver had circulated before any large federal expedition entered the region. At first, rumors were only that: reports, speculation, fragments of possibility attached to a place still legally closed to unauthorized settlement. But rumors could change behavior. They could move through trading posts and towns. They could travel east in letters and conversation. They could attract the attention of men who had never seen the hills, and yet were already beginning to imagine what might be taken from them. The contrast was becoming sharper. For Lakota communities, the hills already possessed value that did not need discovery. For many outsiders, value would soon be measured in what could be extracted, and once that second idea began to spread, the quiet protections written at Fort Laramie would face their first serious test. For several years after the Fort Laramie Treaty, that test did not come all at once. There was no immediate legal opening of the Black Hills, no sudden federal declaration that the treaty had ceased to matter. The reservation remained on paper, and the hills remained inside it. Compared with the conflict that had preceded 1868, the years that followed were relatively peaceful. But interest outside the reservation never disappeared. Rumors of gold and silver continued to circulate. Some were old. Others gained new life as Western settlement expanded, and mineral discoveries elsewhere kept the idea of hidden wealth constantly before the public. A distant mountain country could become valuable in the imagination long before most people had seen it. That was especially true of the Black Hills. From the outside, the region was still poorly known compared with the settled country farther east. Its wooded ridges, streams, grasslands, and mineral possibilities encouraged speculation. Reports moved between military posts, frontier settlements, newspapers, and government offices. The details were often uncertain, but uncertainty itself could create pressure. If gold was there, someone would eventually want proof. By the early 1870s, that question had become difficult for Washington to ignore. The federal government had its own reasons for wanting better knowledge of the Black Hills. The Army operated across a rapidly changing western landscape. Roads, forts, possible future posts, routes of movement, water, grazing, timber, and other resources all had military importance. At the same time, mineral reports had become part of the growing public interest surrounding the region. Those different concerns came together in 1874. At Fort Abraham Lincoln, preparations began for a large military expedition. The popular image of what followed can be misleading. It is easy to imagine George Armstrong Custer riding toward the Black Hills with a few prospectors, chasing gold rumors into forbidden country. The real expedition was far larger and more complicated. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer left Fort Abraham Lincoln on July 2, 1874, at the head of a substantial army column. Close to 1,000 soldiers and teamsters took part, accompanied by military and civilian specialists, aides, horses, wagons, equipment, and supplies. The movement of such a force would have been difficult to miss. Wagon wheels pressed into the ground. Harness leather creaked under steady strain. Horses moved in long lines. Teamsters managed wagons heavy with the material needed to support a large expedition away from established posts. Dust rose behind the column as it moved west. This was not a private prospecting party. It was a federal military expedition, and its purposes were broader than the search for precious metal. The Army wanted reconnaissance. The expedition could help gather information about the country itself and assess its military usefulness. The possible establishment of a post was part of that wider concern. At the same time, the expedition was also expected to investigate reports about the resources of the Black Hills. That included the mineral rumors. So the journey carried several questions at once. What kind of country lay within the hills? How easily could a large military force move through it? What resources were available? Could the region support military operations or perhaps a future post? And were the persistent stories of mineral wealth true? The presence of specialists mattered because these were not questions Custer alone could answer. A military column could record routes and terrain. Teamsters and officers could observe water, grazing, and travel conditions. Civilian and military specialists could examine the physical character of the region more closely. Together, they turned the expedition into something closer to a moving survey than a simple march. That distinction is important. By 1874, the Black Hills were still inside the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty had not been formally replaced, and the land had not been ceded. Yet the United States was now sending a large authorized expedition into that protected country to learn more about it. The very scale of the column revealed how serious federal interest had become. For days, the expedition moved away from Fort Abraham Lincoln toward the hills. The familiar openness of the plains gradually gave way to changing ground. Wagons and horses had to follow the terrain. The column carried its own temporary world with it. Soldiers, teamsters, animals, equipment, specialists, and the daily work required to keep so many people moving. Nothing about that process resembled the quiet mineral rumor that had helped set it in motion. Rumors were weightless. This expedition was not. It had wheels, horses, supplies, orders, and hundreds of people. And because it was a federal mission, what it learned could travel far beyond the country it crossed. That may be the most important way to understand the Custer Black Hills expedition of 1874 before considering what it actually found. The journey did not create outside interest in the hills. That interest already existed. It organized it. It gave the rumors official attention. It brought military reconnaissance, resource investigation, and western expansion into the same moving column. And it created the possibility that uncertain stories about mineral wealth could soon be replaced by something far more powerful, a federal expedition returning with evidence. By early July, the long column was already on the move. Behind it stood Fort Abraham Lincoln. Ahead lay the Black Hills, still protected within the reservation created 6 years earlier. The soldiers and wagons would soon enter that country, and what they reported from inside it would change the pressure surrounding the treaty. But two distinctions have to remain clear before following them any farther. The first concerns the expedition itself. A federally authorized military mission was not legally the same thing as an unauthorized civilian mining party. The second concerns the gold. Custer's expedition was about to make the mineral question famous. That does not mean it was about to discover Black Hills gold for the first time. By the time Custer's column entered the Black Hills later in July 1874, the expedition had already crossed an important line on the treaty map. The hills were still inside the Great Sioux Reservation. No cession had taken place. The treaty remained in force. But the presence of the expedition itself has to be described carefully. Modern summaries sometimes treat Custer's entry as if it were legally identical to the civilian trespass that came later. That is too simple. Article 2 of the Fort Laramie Treaty specifically allowed authorized United States officers, agents, and government employees to enter reservation lands while carrying out lawful duties. Custer's expedition was federally authorized. That does not make its consequences unimportant. The expedition entered treaty-protected country before any Sioux cession, investigated the region in detail, and produced information that would soon encourage unauthorized people to follow. But the clearest treaty violation would come with those civilians. The Army column itself belonged to a different legal category. Inside the hills, the work continued. The landscape must have felt very different from the open country the expedition had crossed to reach it. Pine gave shade. Streams moved through gravel and stone. Grass opened between wooded ridges. In the summer heat, men and animals could pause near water, while specialists examined the country around them. This was the moment when rumor began to change into documented confirmation. For years, stories about precious metals in the Black Hills had circulated, without producing the kind of evidence that could transform national behavior. The 1874 expedition changed that. By mid-August, the expedition had confirmed the presence of gold fields in the Black Hills. That phrase, "confirmed the presence," is important. Popular accounts in the 19th century and afterward often said that Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills. There is a reason that version became so common. His expedition did find and publicly confirm workable gold deposits, and the news that followed drew national attention. But the record supplied here does not support the stronger claim that Custer or his men were the first people ever to find gold there. Gold rumors and earlier reports already existed, so the safer and more accurate description is also the more revealing one. Custer's 1874 expedition confirmed gold in the Black Hills and transformed old rumors into something the wider country could act upon. A handful of uncertain reports could be ignored. A large federal expedition returning with confirmation was different. The difference can be imagined in something as small as a stream. Water moves across gravel beneath the shade of the hills. A specialist bends near the bank. Tools disturb the stones. Material from the stream is examined more closely. The scene itself is quiet. Its consequences are not. Once gold could be reported as something more than frontier rumor. The Black Hills began to acquire an entirely new meaning in the American public imagination. And gold was not the only resource Custer described favorably. His accounts also drew attention to timber, to grazing potential, to agricultural possibilities. The hills were increasingly presented not simply as remote reservation country, but as a place that outsiders could imagine using, settling, and developing. That language mattered. A mineral report might attract prospectors. Descriptions of timber and grazing could suggest a broader economy. Talk of agricultural possibilities could encourage the belief that permanent settlement was practical. Together, those impressions made the Black Hills seem less like distant protected territory and more like a place waiting just beyond a legal barrier. The barrier, however, had not moved. That is one of the central contradictions of 1874. Nothing about the treaty boundary changed when gold was confirmed. The Black Hills did not suddenly leave the Great Sioux Reservation. Article 2 did not disappear. The prohibition against unauthorized settlement did not vanish. What changed was pressure. Information moved outward. Reports traveled beyond the expedition. Newspapers carried the findings to readers who would never see the hills themselves. A place that had existed in distant rumor could now be associated with gold through the authority of a major United States Army expedition. The story grew as it traveled. For the public, Custer's name gave the reports additional force. He was already a nationally recognizable military figure, and his expedition had gone into a region that remained mysterious to many Americans. Now that region was being described in terms the expanding West understood immediately: gold, timber, grass, land that might support settlement. The reports gave the hills a new place in the imagination of people looking west. A prospector reading about gold did not need to understand Article 2 of the Fort Laramie Treaty to know what he wanted. A newspaper did not need to explain Lakota sacred geography before printing a report about mineral wealth. A settler considering the region might see opportunity long before seeing the legal structure that was supposed to keep him out. That imbalance would become increasingly important. The treaty existed in Washington records and in the political relationship created in 1868. The gold reports entered popular circulation, and popular circulation could move far faster than careful legal explanation. The expedition had therefore done something much larger than answer a geological question. It had changed the scale of outside attention. Before 1874, the Black Hills could still be discussed through rumor and speculation. After the expedition, gold could be discussed as confirmed. That did not make civilian entry legal. It made civilian entry more likely. And here the distinction surrounding Custer's expedition becomes essential one final time. It is reasonable to say that the federally authorized expedition entered treaty-protected country and helped unleash the gold rush that followed. It is not equally safe to say that its military presence was simply the same legal violation as an unauthorized mining party. The treaty itself recognized the federal official exception. What came next would be clearer. The Army column would eventually leave the hills. The reports would not. They traveled outward through newspapers, conversation, and the expanding network of Western ambition. And behind those reports came men whose purpose was far simpler than military reconnaissance. They wanted gold. Unlike Custer's authorized expedition, the prospectors who began entering the Black Hills had no treaty exception protecting their presence. The news had moved faster than the soldiers. Now the miners were beginning to follow it. The treaty language had not changed. The movement on the ground had. Once reports of confirmed gold began circulating, prospectors started making their way toward the Black Hills with a purpose very different from Custer's authorized expedition. They were not federal officers carrying out government duties. They were civilians entering reservation land to search for mineral wealth. Under the existing treaty settlement, that made their position much clearer. They were trespassing. The Black Hills still lay inside the Great Sioux Reservation. Unauthorized people were not supposed to pass over, settle upon, or reside within that land. The gold reports had created desire, but desire did not create a legal right to enter. For Washington, this was not merely a theoretical problem. The federal government initially recognized the miners as trespassers and tried to stop them. In September 1874, General Philip Sheridan instructed General Alfred Terry to prevent prospecting parties from entering the Sioux Reservation. If necessary, Sheridan authorized the use of force to carry out that policy. That order is important because it reveals how clearly the government understood its obligation at this stage. The treaty protection was not yet being treated as meaningless language left over from 1868. The Army was expected to enforce it. On the ground, that meant soldiers confronting people who had often traveled a long way with wagons, horses, tools, supplies, and hopes built around the gold reports. A mining party approaching the hills might carry picks, pans, food, blankets, and the equipment needed to remain away from settled towns for some time. The wagons moved slowly. Wheels cut into dirt and grass. Camp smoke rose in the evenings. Then the Army could appear. The message was simple enough. The prospectors were inside land closed to their presence, and they were required to leave. Some parties were turned back, others were expelled. The government was, for a time, using military power not to open the Black Hills, but to keep unauthorized miners out of them. That image is worth holding for a moment. Army horses standing near a miner's wagon, a few prospectors gathering tools they had carried toward the hills, a road leading back out of treaty-protected country. Nothing about that scene fits the later idea that the government immediately opened the Black Hills once Custer reported gold. It did not. At first, federal policy moved in the opposite direction, but the difficulty was already becoming obvious. Gold could draw people faster than the Army could remove them. A party expelled from one place did not end the rush. Other prospectors continued coming. Some returned after being forced out. New groups approached as earlier ones were being removed. The problem was not simply one illegal camp. It was continuous movement. News traveled outward. People traveled inward. The Army stood between those two forces, trying to enforce a treaty boundary across a large and increasingly attractive region. That was far harder than writing an order. A military patrol could stop the prospectors it encountered. It could break up a camp. It could turn a wagon around. But it could not erase the information that had already spread through newspapers and frontier communities. Nor could it easily prevent every small party from approaching the hills by another route. The result was a pattern that repeated itself. Miners entered. Troops tried to remove them. Others came. Some of those removed returned. The presence of gold had created a frontier pressure that did not depend on formal permission. This was one of the deeper problems facing the treaty after 1874. A boundary could be very clear on paper and still become difficult to defend physically. The Great Sioux Reservation covered a vast region. The Black Hills were not surrounded by a fence. There was no single gate where every wagon could be inspected and turned away. There was open country. There were routes. There were streams and valleys that could guide movement. And there were growing numbers of people willing to cross into protected land because they believed wealth might be waiting inside. For Lakota communities, the meaning of this movement was different. The treaty had promised protection against unauthorized settlement and passage. Now civilians were entering the hills precisely for the kind of private purpose the agreement was supposed to restrict. The government's initial response showed that Washington understood the problem. That makes what happened later more significant. In 1874, the story was not yet one of complete federal abandonment. Sheridan's order demonstrates the opposite. At this point, the government still directed the Army to resist the intrusion, yet enforcement alone was not solving the crisis. Each returning party exposed the limits of the policy. Every new wagon represented the same question. How long could Washington continue trying to protect land that more and more Americans wanted opened? Military removal was one possible answer. But it was an expensive and difficult answer because the pressure did not come from one organized force that could simply be defeated or dispersed. It came from individuals and small groups, from prospectors, from speculation, from the belief that the hills contained an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The government now faced a contradiction of its own making. Its treaty said the land was protected. Its army had orders to keep unauthorized miners out. But the federal expedition of 1874 had helped create the very information that made enforcement increasingly difficult. The state had confirmed the attraction. Then it tried to hold back the people drawn by it. For a while, it attempted to do both. The Black Hills remained legally closed to unauthorized civilian entry, and soldiers continued trying to enforce that fact. But the repeated return of miners suggested that removing one party at a time would not settle the larger problem. If Washington wanted the pressure to stop without indefinitely policing the hills against its own citizens, there was another path available. It could try to change who legally controlled the land. That meant returning to negotiation, not to Fort Laramie this time, and not to the broad settlement of 1868. The next effort would focus far more narrowly on one question that gold had made impossible to ignore. What price, if any, could be placed on the Black Hills? Washington's decision to negotiate carried an important admission within it. If the Black Hills had already belonged to the United States in the ordinary sense, there would have been little reason to offer money for them. The federal government's attempt to purchase or lease the hills in 1875 showed that, under the existing settlement, Sioux territorial rights still stood in the way of legal opening. So the problem shifted from enforcement to price. A federal commission was organized and sent west to meet with Lakota representatives. It was headed by Senator William B. Allison, and its purpose was narrow compared with the treaty negotiations of 1868. This was not an effort to settle an entire regional conflict. It was an attempt to acquire the Black Hills. The change in focus was striking. 7 years earlier, discussions at Fort Laramie had dealt with roads, military posts, reservation boundaries, hunting country, settlement, and peace across a huge part of the northern plains. Now gold had compressed the question. The hills themselves had become the object of negotiation. Federal representatives arrived carrying terms that translated the landscape into money. One proposal offered an annual rental of $400,000. The alternative was approximately $6 million for permanent relinquishment. On paper, these were clear figures. They could be written in a column, compared, discussed, adjusted, and that was precisely the difficulty. The government was approaching the Black Hills as territory whose future might be settled through a financial transaction. The land could be leased, or it could be surrendered permanently in return for a stated price. But the country being priced was the same country already described in very different terms by the people connected to it. Pine-covered ridges, streams, bison country, winter camps, places associated with prayer and ceremony, routes tied to movement and memory, political space inside a reservation whose protection had been written into the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Money could measure one kind of value. It could not automatically settle all the others. The meeting itself did not require theatrical speeches to make the contrast clear. Federal negotiators could place their proposal before Lakota representatives. Paper could be unfolded. The figures could be read or interpreted. Horses could stand beyond the council area while wind moved through grass and canvas. And behind every number on the page stood the same wooded country that had drawn prospectors toward the treaty line. For Washington, the offer addressed a growing practical crisis. Miners continued to want access. Army enforcement was difficult. Public pressure for the Black Hills was increasing. A negotiated sale or lease could, at least in theory, remove the legal barrier without simply abandoning the treaty. That helps explain why the Allison Commission matters. The federal government had not yet reached the final stage of dispossession. In 1875, it was still trying to obtain agreement. But the attempt also exposed how far the situation had moved since 1868. The original treaty had promised protected occupation. Now the government that made that promise was asking for the protected land back. And it was asking because gold had changed the political value of keeping the promise. That did not mean Lakota representatives were required to accept the new terms. They did not. The proposals were refused. The negotiations failed. There was no successful agreement to lease the Black Hills for $400,000 a year. There was no accepted permanent sale for approximately $6 million. The land remained, under the existing treaty framework, inside the Great Sioux Reservation. That refusal is important because later events can make the sequence seem more inevitable than it actually was. There was a moment when Washington tried to solve the problem through negotiated acquisition. There was also a moment when the answer was no. The government had tested whether the Black Hills could be converted from protected territory into purchased territory. The effort had failed. That left the underlying pressures exactly where they had been. The miners had not disappeared. The gold had not disappeared. The public appetite for access had not disappeared, and the treaty had not disappeared either. Those facts could not remain comfortably together for long. The contradiction was now sharper than before. Army forces had been asked to keep citizens out of land that many citizens increasingly believed should be opened. Federal negotiators had offered money to acquire that land. The people they needed to persuade had refused the terms. Nothing had been resolved. In the hills, the practical consequences continued to gather. A miner hearing that negotiations had failed did not necessarily turn his wagon around. A newspaper reader interested in gold did not suddenly lose interest because Lakota representatives rejected a federal offer, and an administration trying to manage the western frontier now faced an unpleasant choice. It could continue enforcing the treaty against a growing movement of its own citizens. It could return with different terms and seek another agreement, or it could begin treating the promise of 1868 as an obstacle to policy rather than an obligation guiding it. That final possibility would become increasingly important before the year was over. The Allison Commission therefore marks more than a failed bargain. It marks a transition in the meaning of the Black Hills inside federal policy. The land had first been protected, then it had been explored, then invaded illegally by prospectors, then defended, imperfectly, by Army enforcement. Now it had been given a price, and when the price was rejected, the pressure did not move away from the hills. It moved toward the treaty itself. By late 1875, the question facing Washington was no longer whether people wanted the Black Hills. That was already obvious. The question was whether the United States would continue using military power to protect Sioux treaty rights from those people. The answer came quietly, not in a new treaty, not in a public ceremony, but in federal correspondence that recorded a significant change of policy. By November 1875, the problem had changed from difficult enforcement to deliberate withdrawal. That distinction matters. For more than a year, federal authorities had struggled to keep unauthorized miners out of the Black Hills. Prospectors entered. Soldiers removed some of them. Others came back. New parties followed different routes. The Army could enforce the treaty in one place and still watch the pressure grow somewhere else. So enforcement had genuinely been difficult. But difficulty is not the whole story. By November, President Ulysses S. Grant's administration had decided that the Army should no longer resist miners occupying the Black Hills. The shift was recorded in military correspondence. On November 9th, General Philip Sheridan wrote about the presidential decision and indicated that the change in policy was to be handled quietly. Related correspondence also treated the matter as confidential. There is no need to imagine a dramatic closed-door conversation. The surviving written record is stronger than that. A government that had previously ordered troops to remove unauthorized prospectors was now instructing its military not to make further resistance to their occupation. The treaty itself had not been rewritten. The Black Hills had not been lawfully ceded. The failed purchase negotiations had not produced an agreement. Yet the policy on the ground was changing anyway. This is one of the clearest moments in the entire story. Until then, it was possible to describe the mining crisis partly as an enforcement problem. Too many prospectors were entering. The country was large. Troops could not be everywhere. Men expelled from one camp could return or move elsewhere. All of that was true. But by November 1875, Washington had also made a choice. It would stop resisting the miners. The difference can be seen in a simple frontier image. A few months earlier, a prospecting wagon entering treaty-protected country might encounter soldiers ordered to turn it back. Now imagine that same road after the policy change. The wagon still carries picks, pans, food, blankets, and tools. The wheels still cut into the dirt. The Black Hills are still inside the reservation created by the 1868 treaty. But the military response is no longer the same. The barrier has weakened without the boundary moving an inch. That is what makes this moment so important. The law on paper and the policy in practice were separating. For Lakota communities, the promise of absolute and undisturbed use and occupation depended on more than words in an old treaty. It depended on whether the United States would actually prevent outsiders from settling and remaining on the land. Once the Army stopped resisting occupation, That protection became much harder to recognize in daily reality. Mining movement increased. More people entered the hills. Camps became easier to establish and sustain. The pressure that had once met at least intermittent military resistance could now move more freely. Again, this did not mean that prospecting suddenly became legal under the treaty. It meant that the federal government had chosen not to enforce the restriction as it had before. That difference is essential. There is a tendency in some retellings to suggest that Washington simply became overwhelmed by the number of miners and lost the practical ability to stop them. That explanation contains part of the truth. The Army had struggled. Prospectors repeatedly returned after removals. The scale of the problem was growing. But the November correspondence shows that practical difficulty became something more. It became policy. Enforcement was difficult, but by November 1875, Washington had also made a deliberate decision to stop resisting the miners' occupation. That is a much stronger statement than saying the government merely failed. Failure can be accidental. Withdrawal can be chosen. And in the Black Hills, the consequences of that choice could be felt along roads, streams, and campsites where more prospectors now moved without the same expectation of federal removal. The change also altered the balance between two groups. Unauthorized miners were being given more freedom in practice. At nearly the same time, federal attention was turning more sharply toward Lakota communities who remained away from reservation agencies. That contrast would become increasingly important. On one side were civilians entering land the treaty formally protected from them. On the other were Lakota families and bands moving through country where the same treaty had preserved certain hunting rights. Yet Washington's pressure was beginning to shift away from the trespassers and toward those native communities. The contradiction was no longer subtle. The government had tried to buy the hills. The offer had been rejected. Instead of continuing indefinitely to enforce the treaty against the miners, the administration chose to stop resisting their presence. No new agreement had transferred the land. No 3/4 consent had been obtained. No lawful cession had yet removed the hills from the reservation. Still, the physical occupation accelerated. In that sense, November 1875 marks a quiet but profound turning point. The Black Hills were not yet legally taken, but the federal promise to protect them was being hollowed out in practice. A folded letter could do what a patrol order once prevented. A sentence in military correspondence could change what happened hundreds of miles away on a mining road. The pen moved across paper. The order traveled west, and in the hills, wagons kept coming. By winter, the question of who was allowed to remain outside federal control would be applied very differently to another population. Across the northern plains, Lakota communities were still away from the agencies, many of them in country where the treaty itself had recognized hunting rights. The miners were being left increasingly alone. The hunters would soon receive an ultimatum. Across the northern plains, winter changed the meaning of distance. The ground hardened. Wind moved over open country with little to stop it. Horses breathed into the cold. Camps settled where families could find shelter, water, fuel, and access to game. Movement became slower, more deliberate, and more dependent on weather. Some Lakota communities remained away from reservation agencies during the winter of 1875 and 1876 because they were hunting. That fact matters. Later federal policy would increasingly describe people outside the agencies through a single administrative word, hostile. But location alone did not make every off-agency Lakota person a treaty violator. The Fort Laramie Treaty itself had preserved hunting rights beyond the formal reservation. Article 11 recognized a right to hunt north of the North Platte and along the Republican Fork, while buffalo remained there in sufficient numbers. Article 16 also recognized a separate category of land north of the North Platte and east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains as unceded Indian territory. White settlers were not supposed to occupy that country or pass through it without indigenous consent. So the legal geography of 1868 still mattered in the winter of 1875. A Lakota family camped away from an agency might be living in country where the treaty itself had preserved hunting and access rights. That did not mean the treaty encouraged unlimited permanent residence everywhere outside the reservation. It did not. The agreement pushed strongly toward permanent settlement within the reservation and toward increasing dependence on agency life. But it also did not erase the right to move into specified hunting country. Both things were true at once. That is why the simple phrase, "off reservation," can be misleading when applied to this period. It can sound like a clear legal judgment. Often it was only a description of location. Imagine one of those winter camps beneath a wide northern sky. Families are present. Horses stand close together against the cold. The ground is frozen. Smoke rises slowly and then flattens in the wind. People are not necessarily preparing for battle. They are living in a landscape where hunting, movement, family life, and political independence still overlapped. Some camps could certainly include armed men. These were communities, living through a period of deep political tension and uncertainty. But it would be inaccurate to turn every hunting camp into a military camp simply because federal officials would later classify some of its people as hostile. That label came from policy. It did not automatically describe what every person in such a camp was doing before the order arrived. This distinction becomes even more important when the Black Hills crisis is kept in view. At almost the same moment, unauthorized civilian miners were moving more freely into treaty-protected reservation land because Washington had stopped making the same effort to remove them. Their presence was legally clearer. They were trespassers under the existing treaty settlement. Yet the federal government's attention was shifting toward Lakota communities, whose own movement could still fall within rights written into that same treaty. The contradiction was becoming hard to miss. One population was entering land the treaty said was closed to it. Another was moving through country where the treaty had preserved specified hunting rights. Washington relaxed pressure on the first. It increased pressure on the second. That does not mean every disagreement of the winter can be reduced to a single act of bad faith. The federal government had broader concerns about reservation policy, control of movement, political authority, and communities that remained beyond agency supervision. The treaty itself had encouraged a more settled life within the reservation, but those broader goals did not erase what the written agreement had already recognized. Some of the Lakota, later labeled hostile, were in treaty-recognized hunting country when Washington ordered them back to the agencies. That is the careful way to state it. Not every person outside an agency was necessarily engaged in armed resistance. Not every camp represented one centralized political decision. Lakota communities were not operating under a single command. Families and bands could make different choices. Some remained tied more closely to agencies. Others continued to move through hunting country. Some leaders resisted federal pressure more strongly than others. The landscape itself allowed these differences to continue. Agency boundaries might appear fixed on a federal map. Life beyond them did not. Bison moved. Weather changed. Families traveled. Camps shifted. Horses had to be fed. Food had to be found. And political decisions were made across long distances without the speed of telegraph wires or railroads reaching every camp. That world operated on a different rhythm from Washington paperwork. A federal order could be written in a day. Reaching scattered winter camps was another matter. Complying with that order could be harder still. By late 1875, This gap between administrative expectations and physical reality was about to become crucial. The government was preparing to treat residents away from the agencies not simply as a question of policy, but as a dividing line between compliance and hostility. For the people who would receive that message, however, the situation remained rooted in the same land and treaty language that had shaped the previous 7 years. They were not standing on a blank map. They were in country whose legal status had been defined in 1868. Country where hunting rights had been acknowledged. Country where federal expansion, native movement, and the shrinking world of the bison were now pressing against one another. The winter landscape gave no sign that a bureaucratic deadline was approaching. Wind crossed the plains. Campfires burned low. Horses stood in the cold. Families continued the routines that made life possible away from the agencies. Then Washington imposed a date. The order would tell off-agency bands to return, and it would give them until January 31st, 1876. The date came from Washington on December 6, 1875. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs ordered reservation agents to notify Lakota bands living away from the agencies that they were expected to return by January 31st, 1876. Those who did not return would be treated as hostile. On paper, the order was simple. There was a deadline and a consequence. Across the winter plains, carrying it out was not simple at all. The people affected were scattered across a vast region. Some were living in hunting country recognized by the treaty. Camps were separated by long distances, difficult routes, severe weather, and the daily work of keeping families and horses alive. Before anyone could obey the order, the message first had to reach them. Then whole communities had to move. Families had to break camp, gather belongings, prepare horses, and travel with children and older people through winter conditions. Food, distance, weather, and the strength of the animals all mattered. The clock was already running. Frozen ground hardened beneath hooves. Snow could cover roots. Wind made exposed travel exhausting. A distance that looked manageable on a government map could become something very different when crossed by families in severe winter weather. The January 31 deadline did not change. The later historical review by the United States Supreme Court concluded that the winter conditions made compliance impossible. That finding matters. The ultimatum should not be imagined as a simple choice offered to every Lakota person outside an agency: return peacefully or deliberately choose war. For many, the physical circumstances made that choice far less straightforward. Some were in treaty-recognized hunting country. Some were far from the agencies. Winter travel itself could make movement extremely difficult. Yet federal policy treated the date as decisive. Before the deadline, an off-agency camp might be a hunting camp, a family camp, a community exercising treaty-recognized movement, a group resisting closer agency control, or some combination of those things. After the deadline, Washington intended to place those who had not returned into one official category: hostile. The word carried consequences. It turned a question of movement and reservation policy into one that could be handed to the military. The older treaty language did not disappear when January 31 arrived. The hunting provisions of 1868 remained part of the written agreement. But federal policy was moving away from that older geography. Compliance was increasingly being measured by one question: had communities reported to the agencies on Washington's timetable? The contrast with the Black Hills had become difficult to ignore. Unauthorized miners had entered reservation land. The government had first tried to remove them. Then it had stopped resisting their occupation. At nearly the same time, Lakota communities living beyond agency control were being ordered to move inward by a fixed winter deadline. The miners had crossed a boundary the treaty said they should not cross. The hunters were now being ordered to move under federal authority. That is one reason the winter of 1875 and 1876 became such an important turning point. The crisis was no longer only about gold, illegal prospecting, or failed negotiations. It was becoming a struggle over movement, control, and the power to decide where people could remain. In the distant camps, winter continued on its own schedule. Smoke drifted low. Horses stood in the cold. Wind moved across the plains. January approached. So did the deadline. When January 31 passed, federal policy hardened. Those who had not reported to the agencies were classified as hostile. That label did not prove that every individual had consciously chosen armed resistance. The order created the category. The circumstances of the people placed within it were far more varied, but Washington was preparing to act on the category. On February 1, 1876, jurisdiction over the Lakota, classified as hostile, was transferred to the War Department. That was more than an administrative change. Until then, the crisis had moved through treaty policy, Indian agents, negotiations, and government orders. Now the military would take the leading role. The distance between a winter hunting camp and an army objective had suddenly narrowed. No new treaty had produced that change. No new gold discovery had caused it. It had emerged from a chain of decisions: gold confirmed, miners entering, enforcement weakening, purchase negotiations failing, resistance to mining occupation ending, and finally, a winter deadline imposed on Lakota communities, away from the agencies. By February 1876, those decisions had pushed the Black Hills crisis into a new stage. The War Department was now responsible for those classified as hostile, and the dispute over land, movement, and treaty rights was becoming a broader military conflict across the northern plains. The Black Hills crisis was one of the principal sparks of the Great Sioux War. It was not the only cause. By 1876, the conflict had gathered together several older struggles that had never truly disappeared. Disputes over land, movement, hunting country, reservation policy, federal expansion, and the effort to confine native communities within a system they had not all accepted. The gold crisis made those pressures sharper. The treaty breakdown gave them a new political center, and the January Ultimatum helped turn them into military policy. The Army campaigns that followed became known as the Great Sioux War, also commonly called the Black Hills War. The second name captures something important. The Black Hills were central to the crisis. Gold had drawn miners into treaty-protected land. Federal enforcement had weakened. Purchase negotiations had failed. Washington had stopped resisting mining occupation. Then off-agency Lakota communities were ordered back under a winter deadline. But the war did not begin from gold alone. Its roots reached farther back. The Powder River country had already been contested before the Treaty of 1868. The Bozeman Trail, military forts, hunting territory, and the struggle over who could move through the northern plains had produced Red Cloud's War. The treaty had quieted some of that conflict without erasing the deeper disagreement. Lakota communities still depended on hunting country beyond the agencies. Bison remained central to life across the plains. Federal policy continued pushing toward reservation residents, agency control, and greater dependence on government systems. Those pressures did not affect every Lakota band in exactly the same way, nor did every community respond with one unified political decision. That is another simplification worth avoiding. The Great Sioux War was not directed by a single centralized Sioux command. The conflict involved Lakota communities and allied Northern Cheyenne forces, including groups associated with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. But these communities were not one army moving under one headquarters. They were dispersed across a vast landscape. Different bands made different decisions. Some remained closer to agencies. Others stayed in hunting country. Some leaders resisted federal pressure more strongly. Others followed different paths. The Army, therefore, was not moving toward one capital or one fixed enemy base. It was moving into country occupied by shifting communities, hunting camps, family groups, and fighting forces spread over immense distances. That geography shaped the war. From military posts and logistical points, Army columns moved outward across the northern plains. Fort Laramie, which had once been a place of treaty negotiation, now served as a staging and logistical point for the 1876 campaign. The change was striking. 8 years earlier, the fort had stood near the center of an agreement meant to reduce military pressure and establish territorial protections. Now supplies, men, horses, and orders passed through the same wider frontier system as the government prepared for another campaign. Cold mornings came early. Hooves struck frozen or damp ground. Columns crossed rivers and followed long routes through open country. Beyond them, distant camp smoke might mark communities whose exact movements were difficult to predict. The war unfolded across space rather than around one single objective. That is why the Black Hills should be understood as a major trigger rather than a complete explanation. Popular retellings sometimes compress the entire conflict into one simple chain. Gold was found, the government wanted the hills, and war followed. There is truth inside that sequence. The gold crisis mattered enormously. The treaty violations mattered. The failed purchase effort mattered. The ultimatum mattered. But the conflict had been built over years. Control of hunting country mattered. Resistance to confinement mattered. The decline of a bison-dependent way of life under expanding pressure mattered. Federal expansion mattered. So did older arguments over roads, forts, and who had authority across the northern plains. The Black Hills crisis brought those tensions together. It gave Washington a new reason to press harder. It gave Lakota and allied communities another reason to distrust federal promises. And it turned an old struggle over movement and territory into a campaign with wider consequences. The word war can make this process seem sudden. It was not. There was no single morning when everything before it belonged to peace and everything after it belonged to war. The transition had been gradual. First came pressure around the hills, then military reconnaissance, then confirmed gold, then illegal civilian entry, then Army enforcement, then failed negotiations, then the decision to stop resisting miners, then the order requiring off-agency bands to return. Finally, jurisdiction passed to the War Department. By that point, the political dispute had become military. The Army now treated those classified as hostile as targets of a campaign. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities faced growing pressure across the hunting country. The older treaty maps still existed on paper, but the movement of soldiers increasingly defined what happened on the ground. That tension between paper and landscape had followed the story from the beginning. At Fort Laramie, lines and promises had been written carefully. In the Black Hills, miners had crossed those lines. Across the winter plains, Lakota families had been ordered to cross others. Now Army columns were moving through the same contested world. The conflict that followed would contain many encounters, movements, and decisions. Most would never become famous outside specialist histories. One battle would. Its name would eventually overshadow almost everything that came before it. Little Bighorn. But to understand what happened there, the battle has to remain inside the larger war. It was not the beginning of the conflict. It was not the end. And it was not fought simply over a mining camp or a single patch of gold-bearing ground. It belonged to the wider struggle already unfolding across the northern plains, a struggle over land, movement, hunting country, federal power, and the consequences of a treaty promise that had begun to break under pressure years before Custer rode toward the Little Bighorn. On June 25, 1876, the larger war produced the battle that would come to dominate its memory. Along the Little Bighorn River, summer grass moved across the valley while Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities occupied the country nearby. Army forces were already operating as part of the wider campaign that had followed the Winter Ultimatum. George Armstrong Custer was part of that campaign. What happened to his immediate command that day became one of the most famous episodes in the history of the American West. His force was destroyed. That fact is important, but it is also where the story is easiest to distort. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not the beginning of the Great Sioux War. The war was already underway. Nor was the battle fought directly over possession of a specific gold mine or mining camp in the Black Hills. That version compresses too much history into one dramatic scene. The battlefield lay within a much larger conflict that had grown from treaty breakdown, the Black Hills Crisis, federal reservation policy, the January Ultimatum, and the struggle over control of the Northern Plains. Gold was part of the chain. The battle was not a fight over a claim stake beside a stream. To understand its place in this story, the view has to widen. Imagine first the familiar image: a river, open grass, ridges rising above the valley, mounted men moving across the country. The immediate drama draws the eye inward, toward Custer and the fate of his command. Then pull back. Beyond the battlefield lay a much larger map. Army columns had been moving through the northern plains in an effort to bring Lakota and allied Northern Cheyenne communities under greater federal control. Those communities were not gathered because of one mining camp. They existed within the broader hunting country and political world that had been under increasing pressure for years. The Black Hills dispute had intensified that pressure. The federal government had failed to purchase the hills in 1875. It had stopped resisting miners who entered them. Then it had ordered off-agency Lakota bands back under a winter deadline. When that deadline passed, those who had not returned were classified as hostile and placed under War Department jurisdiction. Little Bighorn came after those decisions. That sequence matters, because the famous battle can otherwise seem almost detached from the treaty story. It was not. The road from Fort Laramie to the Little Bighorn was not a literal road on a map. It was a chain of policy. A treaty promised territorial protection. Gold increased outside pressure. Unauthorized miners crossed into reservation land. Enforcement first continued, then weakened. Negotiations failed. Federal policy shifted. The ultimatum followed. Military campaigning expanded. And then, on June 25th, Custer's command encountered a large concentration of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne people during that campaign. The result shocked the United States. But the battle itself did not settle the question that had produced the war. The Black Hills remained at the center of federal pressure. Reservation policy remained unresolved. Lakota communities still faced efforts to restrict movement and bring people under agency control. The wider military campaign continued. That is why Custer's defeat should be understood as a major event inside the Great Sioux War, not as its final chapter. In popular memory, Little Bighorn can appear almost like a climax that ends the story. Historically, it did the opposite. The war continued. The federal response intensified. Pressure on indigenous communities and hunting country increased rather than faded, so the battlefield should not be allowed to block the view beyond it. The summer grass, the river, and the ridges are one scene. The larger struggle stretches far outside them. For Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities, the victory at Little Bighorn did not restore the security promised in 1868. It did not remove miners from the Black Hills. It did not reverse the Grant administration's earlier decision to stop resisting mining occupation. It did not erase the federal drive toward reservation control, and it did not end the Army campaign. The famous military result and the deeper political result were not the same thing. That distinction is essential in a story about a broken treaty. If the documentary stopped at Custer's defeat, the viewer might leave with the impression that the central conflict had somehow been decided on June 25th. It had not. The treaty dispute was still moving toward another kind of resolution, not one created on the battlefield. One created through sustained military pressure, dependency, legislation, and later attempts to obtain land surrender under very different conditions from those of 1868. Little Bighorn therefore sits at the center of the story without being its endpoint. It is where the wider conflict became famous. It is not where the wider conflict became understandable. That understanding comes only by keeping the battle connected to what surrounded it. The Black Hills gold crisis, the broken enforcement of treaty protections, the failed effort to purchase the land, the winter ultimatum, the struggle over hunting country and reservation control, and the continuing federal expansion that had been shaping the northern plains long before Custer entered the valley. The battle passed into legend almost immediately. The larger war kept moving. Army pressure continued through 1876 and into 1877. Communities moved through shrinking spaces. Hunting grounds came under greater pressure. Surrender increasingly carried consequences that reached beyond military defeat itself. And as that pressure accumulated, another federal strategy became more important. The next stage would not be defined mainly by a battlefield. It would be defined by horses, weapons, agency dependence, and the growing power of federal rations. Custer's command had been defeated at Little Bighorn. Washington's determination to force a wider settlement had not. After Little Bighorn, the war did not fade. Federal military pressure increased through the rest of 1876 and into 1877. Army operations reached deeper into indigenous hunting grounds and placed growing pressure on Lakota and allied communities that were still moving beyond the agencies. The struggle was no longer centered on one famous battlefield. It spread across country, across winter routes, across hunting grounds, across the practical ability of families and bands to remain independent of federal control. That is where the nature of the conflict began to change again. Military campaigning could force movement. It could make hunting more difficult. It could narrow the spaces where communities could remain beyond the reservation system. And when people surrendered, the consequences could extend beyond the immediate end of armed resistance. Some Lakota communities were deprived of horses and weapons after surrender. Those losses mattered. A horse was not simply transportation. Horses made movement possible across large distances. They helped families travel, hunt, relocate camps, and remain connected to a wider landscape. When horse herds diminished, mobility diminished with them. Weapons carried an equally practical meaning in hunting country. Their removal reduced not only military capacity, but also part of the independence required to live beyond agency support. The result was a quieter kind of pressure. Imagine an agency after surrender, cold ground underfoot, wagons moving in and out, horse lines that are smaller than before, supplies arriving in sacks and boxes, families increasingly dependent on food distributed through a federal system. The battlefield has disappeared from the scene. The pressure has not. This growing dependence on federal rations changed the balance of power. Communities that had once relied more heavily on movement, hunting, and their own horses could become increasingly dependent on supplies controlled by the same government pressing for territorial concessions. That did not mean every surrender produced identical conditions. Nor did every Lakota community lose horses, weapons, or autonomy in exactly the same way. But for some, these losses became part of a larger movement toward agency dependence, and that dependence mattered politically. A government that controls food distribution holds a different kind of influence from an army column. Military force can move people. Ration policy can shape what choices remain after they arrive. The distinction is important because the Black Hills had still not been transferred simply by military victory. Custer's defeat did not settle ownership. Later Army pressure did not, by itself, satisfy the treaty requirement for ceding commonly held reservation land. The legal question remained, but the conditions surrounding any future negotiation were changing. In 1868, Lakota representatives had negotiated after a conflict in which the United States had agreed to abandon forts and close the Bozeman Trail. By late 1876, the balance was very different. Military pressure was growing. Hunting country was becoming harder to use freely. Some communities had surrendered. Some had lost horses and weapons. Dependence on federal rations was increasing. A negotiation conducted under those conditions could not be understood in the same way as the settlement at Fort Laramie 8 years earlier. This is where the story moves away from the dramatic language of battle and toward the quieter mechanics of coercion. No cavalry charge is required. No famous battlefield is needed. A ration sack can become politically important. So can an appropriations bill. So can the knowledge that food expected at an agency depends on decisions made far away in Washington. That kind of pressure was already becoming visible while the Great Sioux War continued. The government was not relying on one method. Army campaigns pressed communities militarily. Agency policy increased dependence. Congress would soon connect subsistence directly to the surrender of land and hunting rights. The Black Hills therefore remained at the center of the conflict, even when the Army was operating far from the hills themselves. This was never only a question of who physically occupied a particular ridge or mining stream. It was a question of whether the United States could create conditions under which resistance to territorial surrender became increasingly difficult to sustain. By 1876 and 1877, those conditions were changing rapidly. The open hunting country that had once allowed greater independence was under greater military pressure. The bison-dependent world that supported movement beyond agencies was becoming harder to maintain under the growing weight of federal expansion and campaigning. People arriving after surrender faced a system designed to concentrate life more closely around agencies. There, food could become leverage. The change can be seen in the simplest contrast. Earlier in the story, a Lakota camp could move across hunting country with horses, families, and access to game. Now some communities stood closer to agency distribution points, with fewer horses, fewer weapons, and greater reliance on government rations. That shift did not happen in one moment. It accumulated, like the treaty breakdown itself. First pressure, then reduced movement, then surrender, then dependence. And dependence created new political possibilities for Washington. The federal government no longer had to imagine persuasion only as a council where representatives debated a price for the Black Hills. It could connect negotiation to the material conditions of agency life. That was a much stronger lever. The soundscape of the story changed with it. Fewer hoofbeats moving freely across long distances. More wagon traffic around agencies. More waiting for supplies. More lives tied to decisions made through federal administration. The Great Sioux War was still continuing, but the struggle over the Black Hills was entering another phase. Military pressure had altered the circumstances. Now Congress would use those circumstances. In August 1876, while the war was still unfolding, lawmakers reached for a tool quieter than cavalry, and more direct than another failed purchase offer. Future Sioux subsistence appropriations would be tied to surrender. The government had found a way to place food itself inside the negotiation. On August 15, 1876, Congress made that leverage explicit. The appropriations measure passed that day tied future Sioux subsistence funding to the surrender of the Black Hills and treaty hunting rights. The policy connected two things that had once been treated separately: land and food. That connection gave Washington a different kind of power. By this point, some Lakota communities had already been pushed closer to agency life through military pressure, surrender, reduced mobility, and growing dependence on federal rations. Supplies delivered by wagon were no longer simply part of an administrative system. They could become part of the negotiation itself. At an agency, the pressure could be seen without any dramatic speech. Canvas sacks stacked near a distribution point, wagons arriving with supplies, families waiting, paperwork moving through federal hands. And somewhere far from that cold ground, Congress had decided that future subsistence appropriations would depend on territorial surrender. No invented threat is needed to understand the force of that arrangement. The circumstances carried the pressure. The Black Hills had already been the subject of one failed federal purchase effort in 1875. Lakota representatives had rejected the Allison Commission's terms. Since then, miners had continued entering the hills. The Army had stopped resisting their occupation. The winter ultimatum had pushed the crisis toward war, and military pressure had increased across the northern plains. Now Washington returned to the land question under very different conditions. The new effort came through what became known as the Manypenny Commission. The commission arrived with proposed terms already drafted. It presented those terms to chiefs and leading men, and the proposal reached beyond the Black Hills alone. The agreement required relinquishment of the Black Hills, other Western reservation lands, and treaty hunting rights. In return, continued subsistence was part of the arrangement. That was a profound change from the situation at Fort Laramie in 1868. Then, the United States had negotiated after agreeing to abandon forts and close the Bozeman Trail. Now, communities facing military pressure and growing ration dependence were being asked to surrender territory and hunting rights, while future subsistence itself had been made conditional. The setting may have looked quiet. The political weight was not. A federal representative could place the written terms before Lakota leaders. The language could be translated. The document could be passed from hand to hand. Nearby, people depended increasingly on food controlled through the agency system. The relationship between paper and survival had become immediate. That is why the appropriations measure matters so much. It did not merely express congressional support for acquiring the Black Hills. It tied that objective to material dependency. The government had found a way to apply pressure without relying only on military movement. An army column could compel people toward agencies. Appropriations could shape the choices available once they were there. The two forms of pressure reinforced one another. Military campaigning narrowed independence in the field. Ration policy increased federal influence at the agency. Together, they changed the conditions under which consent was being sought. This does not mean every individual decision can be reduced to hunger or coercion alone. Different leaders faced different circumstances. Different communities made different choices. Some chiefs and leading men would sign. Others would not. But the wider structure of the negotiation cannot be separated from the congressional condition already in place. Future subsistence had been linked to surrender. The distinction between a free bargain and a pressured agreement had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The Black Hills were again being translated into terms Washington could administer. Acres, boundaries, hunting rights, rations, appropriations, signatures. The spiritual, material, and political meanings of the land remained what they had been for Lakota communities. But federal policy was reducing the issue to a set of conditions that could be written into an agreement and enforced through control of resources. The same land that had once been protected by treaty was now being placed on the other side of a subsistence condition. That is the quiet power of this moment. No battle is required, no gunfire, no dramatic confrontation, only a ration line and a document. The struggle over the Black Hills had moved from mining roads and army patrols into the machinery of federal administration. And that machinery could be just as decisive. The Manypenny Commission's terms demanded more than a simple acknowledgement of existing settlement. They sought formal relinquishment. The Black Hills, other Western reservation lands, treaty hunting rights. The agreement was therefore aimed at changing the legal structure created in 1868, not merely adjusting one temporary policy. That made the question of consent unavoidable. The Fort Laramie Treaty had already established a rule for surrendering commonly held reservation land. Article 12 required an extraordinary level of approval. The government could not simply treat a small number of signatures as enough if the treaty's own standard was to be followed. For the moment, however, the commission continued its work. Documents were presented. Names were gathered. Some chiefs and leading men signed. Washington had obtained something it had failed to obtain the year before. But the existence of signatures was only the beginning of the legal question. The real issue was how many. Because the Treaty of 1868 had already answered that question in advance. A valid cession required 3/4 of the adult male population occupying or interested in the reservation. The Manypenny Commission would fall far short of that mark. The difference between what the treaty required and what the commission obtained was enormous. Article 12 of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had established a clear rule for surrendering commonly held reservation land. A cession could not be valid against the people concerned unless at least 3/4 of all adult male Indians occupying or interested in the reservation had agreed. 3/4. That was the standard written into the treaty. The agreement presented in 1876 came nowhere close. Some Sioux chiefs and leading men did sign the Manypenny Commission's document. That fact should not be erased. There were indigenous signatures on the agreement, and any accurate account has to acknowledge them. But the number mattered. Only about 10% of the adult male Sioux population signed. About 10%, against a requirement of 3/4. Placed side by side on the page, the contrast is difficult to soften. The treaty required roughly 75%. The commission obtained about 10%. That numerical difference is one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the entire Black Hills story. It means the agreement cannot safely be described as a treaty-compliant voluntary sale of the hills. Washington had obtained some signatures. It had not obtained the consent required by the treaty it was trying to alter. The distinction is important because later summaries can compress the event into a familiar phrase. The Sioux sold the Black Hills. That wording makes the transfer sound far simpler than the record allows. There had been negotiations. There had been signatures. But the treaty itself had set a much higher threshold for giving away commonly held reservation land. That threshold was not met. The scene can be reduced to something almost ordinary. Paper laid out before a council. Names entered in ink. Federal representatives gathering signatures. The document growing longer as more men signed. Yet beside those signature pages stood another document, written 8 years earlier, Article 12. Its requirement did not disappear simply because the political circumstances had changed. 3/4 remained 3/4. The pressure surrounding the 1876 agreement also mattered. This was not the same setting as Fort Laramie in 1868. The Black Hills had already been entered by unauthorized miners. The government had stopped resisting that occupation. War had followed. Some Lakota communities had surrendered. Some had lost horses and weapons. Ration dependence had increased. Congress had tied future subsistence appropriations to surrender of the Black Hills and hunting rights. Then the commission arrived with terms already drafted. Those circumstances do not mean every signature was meaningless or that every signer acted for exactly the same reason. The record supplied here does not justify reducing individual decisions to a single motive, but the broader context makes it impossible to describe the agreement as an ordinary sale freely completed under the procedure of the 1868 treaty. The procedure had a measurable requirement, and the requirement was not satisfied. That is the central point. The federal government had originally written a safeguard into the treaty that made surrendering commonly held reservation land deliberately difficult. A small group could not simply give it away for everyone. A minority of signatures could not automatically bind the larger population. The 3/4 rule was meant to matter. In 1876, it became inconvenient. Washington had already failed once to purchase or lease the Black Hills through the Allison Commission. The pressure for the land had only grown. Military and economic conditions had changed, but the treaty rule remained. If federal policy had stopped there, the Black Hills would still not have been transferred under the procedure established in 1868. That is why the next step matters so much. The government did not solve the problem by obtaining enough additional signatures to reach the required threshold. It solved the problem another way. Congress acted. This is also where the later legal history becomes useful, even though its full meaning belongs later in the story. The Supreme Court would eventually treat the 1877 transfer as a taking, not as a freely negotiated purchase completed at full value under the original treaty procedure. That later judgment fits the documentary contrast already visible in 1876. Some signatures existed. The required consent did not. So the strongest wording is also the simplest. Washington obtained some signatures, but not the 3/4 required by the 1868 treaty. Congress then imposed the transfer by statute. That formulation avoids two opposite errors. It does not claim that no Lakota or Sioux representative signed anything, and it does not pretend that the signatures obtained satisfied the treaty. Both facts have to remain visible. The difference between them is the story. By the end of the commission process, the federal government possessed a document that looked like an agreement. What it did not possess was the level of consent Article 12 demanded. That gap could not be closed by calling the agreement a sale. It could only be closed by changing the legal mechanism, and that is exactly what happened. The issue moved out of the council setting and into Congress. Paper would still decide the fate of the hills, but not through the treaty procedure written at Fort Laramie. The signatures had fallen far short. The next document would not ask for 3/4 consent. It would be an act of the United States Congress. And on February 28, 1877, that act would change the legal status of the Black Hills without satisfying the treaty rule that had been written to protect them. On February 28, 1877, Congress completed what the treaty process had not. The transfer of the Black Hills did not come through an agreement that satisfied Article 12 of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. It came through an act of Congress. That distinction is the legal center of the story. The 1868 treaty had placed the Black Hills inside the Great Sioux Reservation and had established a demanding procedure for surrendering commonly held reservation land. 3/4 consent had been required. The 1876 agreement had fallen far short of that threshold. Congress proceeded anyway. Through the act of February 28, 1877, the federal government implemented the arrangement and effectively abrogated key provisions of the earlier treaty. The Black Hills were removed from the Great Sioux Reservation. On paper, the change could be expressed in legal language. On the ground, It changed the status of a real place. The pine-covered ridges were still there. Streams still ran through stone and grass. Winter air still settled over the hills. But the federal government now treated land protected under the 1868 settlement as land removed from that reservation by statute. The landscape had not changed. The legal claim over it had. That is what makes February 1877 so important. The taking of the Black Hills was not one sudden event detached from everything that came before. It was the final step in a chain. First, the Treaty of Fort Laramie had recognized the reservation and promised protected occupation. Then mineral rumors drew new attention. Custer's 1874 expedition confirmed gold and intensified national interest. Unauthorized civilian prospectors entered treaty-protected land. The Army initially tried to remove them. Enforcement proved difficult. Washington then attempted to purchase or lease the hills through negotiation. Those negotiations failed. By November 1875, the Grant administration had deliberately stopped resisting mining occupation. Then came the order requiring off-agency Lakota bands to return by January 31, 1876. Those who did not were classified as hostile. Jurisdiction passed to the War Department. The Great Sioux War followed. After Little Bighorn, military pressure continued. Some Lakota communities surrendered and became increasingly dependent on federal rations. Congress then tied future subsistence appropriations to surrender of the Black Hills and hunting rights. The Manypenny Commission obtained some signatures, but not the 3/4 required by the treaty. And so Congress changed the mechanism. It acted by statute. Seen in sequence, the broken promise was not simply that the United States once said one thing and later said another. The process was more gradual than that. The treaty remained on paper, while its protections weakened in practice. Miners crossed into the hills before legal title changed. Federal enforcement first resisted them, then ceased. Negotiation was attempted, then replaced by greater pressure. Military and economic conditions narrowed the range of choices available to Lakota communities. Finally, when the treaty's own consent requirement was not met, Congress imposed the transfer through legislation. That is the 19th century answer to the central question. How did treaty-protected Black Hills become land the United States claimed outside the Great Sioux Reservation? Not through a cession that fulfilled Article 12, through the act of February 28, 1877. The difference matters, because words such as sale, purchase, surrender, and transfer can make very different historical processes sound alike. A voluntary sale suggests agreement between parties under accepted terms. A treaty-compliant cession would have required the level of consent specified in 1868. What happened instead was congressional action after that threshold had not been reached. The federal government imposed a new legal reality over the old treaty framework. And by then, physical reality had already moved far ahead. Miners had entered. Settlement pressure had grown. The Army had ceased resisting occupation. War had reshaped the northern plains. The statute brought federal law into alignment with a territorial change already being driven on the ground. This is why the story of the Black Hills cannot be reduced to a gold rush alone. Gold created pressure, but government decisions determined how that pressure interacted with treaty obligations. Officials could have continued trying to enforce the existing settlement. They could have continued negotiating. Instead, over time, policy moved toward occupation, coercion, military pressure, and finally statutory removal. That sequence gives the title its meaning. The broken promise was not metaphorical. It rested on identifiable treaty language and identifiable federal acts. The reservation had been promised for protected occupation. Unauthorized settlement had been restricted. A procedure for land cession had been written into the agreement. Then those protections were progressively overridden. By early 1877, the Black Hills that had stood inside the Great Sioux Reservation in 1868 stood outside it under federal law. The change had taken less than 9 years, and yet even this was not the final word on what the United States had done. For decades afterward, the legal consequences of the transfer remained contested. The question would eventually reach the highest court in the country. There, the events of 1877 would be examined not merely as an old frontier dispute, but as a question of property, compensation, and federal conduct. More than a century after the Fort Laramie Treaty, the Supreme Court would look back at the same sequence: the treaty, the failed consent requirement, the Congressional Act, the loss of the Black Hills, and it would have to decide what that transfer had been in legal terms. The answer would not restore the landscape to its earlier status, but it would give the 19th century story a powerful later judgment. The federal government had changed the law in 1877. In 1980, the Supreme Court would decide what that change had cost. On June 30th, 1980, the Supreme Court returned to the Black Hills. More than a century had passed since the Treaty of Fort Laramie. More than a century since Congress removed the hills from the Great Sioux Reservation. Now, in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the court examined what the federal government had done in 1877. Its conclusion was significant. The Supreme Court upheld the finding that the 1877 Act had effected a taking of tribal property, for which just compensation was required. That language matters. The Black Hills had not simply changed hands through an ordinary treaty sale. The later legal judgment treated the congressional action as a taking. The court did not need to recreate the frontier through memory or legend. It could look backward through documents. The 1868 treaty, the failed effort to obtain the required consent, the pressure surrounding the 1876 agreement. The Act of 1877, page by page, the 19th century sequence returned. In the court's historical review, earlier judicial findings described federal dealings surrounding the acquisition of the hills as unfair and dishonorable, and recognized the coercive pressure under which the transfer had occurred. Those words did not come from a modern documentary title. They came from the legal record examining how the United States had acquired the land. That gives the story an unusual kind of clarity. For generations, the Black Hills dispute could be described politically, culturally, historically, and morally. In 1980, federal law also had to assign a legal consequence to the taking. The court upheld a valuation of approximately $17.1 million as the fair market value of the Black Hills property taken in 1877. The award also included interest dating from 1877. The calculation tried to answer a question courts are built to answer. What monetary compensation was due for property taken long ago? But that is not the same as answering what the Black Hills meant. A dollar figure can estimate market value. It can measure land as property at a particular historical moment. It cannot measure sacred geography. It cannot measure generations of memory. It cannot reduce political autonomy, hunting country, ceremony, identity, or the meaning of a homeland to one sum. The court was resolving a legal claim. It was not resolving every meaning attached to the hills. And there is another distinction that must remain clear. The Supreme Court did not order the United States to return the Black Hills. Its judgment concerned compensation. That difference is essential. A listener encountering the 1980 case in a shortened version of the story might easily imagine a ruling that reversed the 1877 transfer and restored the land. That did not happen. The legal remedy was monetary. The landscape remained where it had always been: pine, stone, streams, ridges rising over the plains. The same physical place that had stood inside the Great Sioux Reservation in 1868 still stood there in 1980, but under a political and legal reality created through the history already traced. That history now had 3 dates that could be placed side by side. In 1868, the treaty placed the Black Hills within the Great Sioux Reservation and promised protected occupation. In 1877, Congress removed them after the treaty's required level of consent had not been obtained. In 1980, the Supreme Court upheld the conclusion that this congressional action amounted to a taking requiring just compensation. The distance between those dates is more than a century. The documentary evidence connects them directly. That is why the later case matters to the older story. It does not replace historical interpretation. It confirms that the central dispute was not invented after the fact. The question of how the Black Hills were acquired survived because the legal mechanism itself remained contested. The Treaty of Fort Laramie had created obligations. The events of the 1870s had undermined those obligations. Congress had imposed a new arrangement, and eventually, the highest court in the United States recognized a compensable taking. The judgment also changes the way familiar language should be heard. The Sioux sold the Black Hills is too simple. The United States simply conquered them in war is also incomplete. The actual sequence was more complicated and more revealing. There had been treaty protections, unauthorized mining, failed enforcement, a failed purchase, a deliberate decision to stop resisting miners, a winter ultimatum, military pressure, ration leverage, insufficient signatures, then congressional action. The Supreme Court's later decision looked back across that sequence and treated the result as a taking. That does not settle every historical argument. It does not erase the many causes of the Great Sioux War. It does not transform every federal official into a single motive or every Lakota community into a single political position. But it does anchor one central conclusion firmly in the legal record. The transfer of the Black Hills was not a straightforward voluntary sale completed under the consent procedure of the 1868 treaty. More than a century later, the government's own courts were still dealing with the consequences. There is something quiet about that final legal scene. No cavalry, no mining camp, no council surrounded by horses, only documents under careful examination, paper turning in an archive, words written in different centuries placed beside one another, absolute and undisturbed use and occupation, the Congressional Act of 1877, the Supreme Court opinion of 1980. Each document belongs to a different moment. Together, they tell one continuous story. A promise made, a protection weakened, a transfer imposed, a taking recognized. Yet even that sequence cannot be the last image. Courts can identify legal injury. They can calculate compensation. They can preserve findings in printed opinions. But the Black Hills were never only a legal object. They were a place before they became a federal case, and they remained a place after the judgment was written. So the story has one final movement left, away from the courtroom, away from congressional paper, away from the calculations of value, back toward the pine-covered ridges, the stone, the streams, and the land where the promise had first taken meaning. Evening settles over the Black Hills much as it did before the gold camps came. Cool air moves through the ponderosa. Water passes over stone. Grass darkens along the forest edge, and the ridges hold their shape against the fading light. Nothing in the landscape itself explains the treaties, military orders, mining claims, congressional acts, or court opinions placed over it. Those belong to human history. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty placed the Black Hills inside the Great Sioux Reservation and promised that reservation for the Sioux Nation's absolute and undisturbed use and occupation. That promise grew from an older struggle over the Bozeman Trail, military posts, hunting country, movement, and federal expansion. The treaty protected reservation land, restricted unauthorized entry, and preserved specific hunting rights beyond the reservation. Those distinctions mattered because Lakota life did not stop at an agency boundary. Then gold changed the pressure surrounding the treaty. Custer's federally authorized expedition entered the hills in 1874 and confirmed gold there. It did not necessarily make the first discovery. Earlier rumors and reports already existed. What the expedition did was turn those rumors into confirmation, powerful enough to help trigger a national rush. The clearer treaty violation came afterward. Unauthorized civilian miners entered reservation land. At first, the federal government tried to remove them. Enforcement was genuinely difficult, but difficulty eventually became policy. Washington tried to purchase or lease the hills through the Allison Commission. Lakota representatives rejected the offer. Then, in late 1875, the Grant administration decided the Army would no longer resist the miners' occupation. The treaty remained. The miners kept entering. Federal protection was withdrawing. That widening gap between promise and practice is the central thread of the Black Hills story. The promise did not collapse in one moment. Failed enforcement became deliberate non-resistance. Failed negotiation gave way to greater pressure, and federal attention shifted increasingly toward Lakota communities rather than toward civilians occupying treaty-protected land. During the winter of 1875 and 1876, some Lakota, later labeled hostile, were in treaty-recognized hunting country. Their presence away from agencies did not automatically make them treaty violators. Yet Washington ordered off-agency bands to return by January 31, 1876. Severe winter conditions made compliance impossible. When the deadline passed, those who had not returned were classified as hostile. Jurisdiction moved to the War Department. The territorial crisis had become part of a military campaign. That campaign became known as the Great Sioux War, or Black Hills War. But the Black Hills were not its only cause. The crisis was one of the principal sparks within an older struggle over land, movement, hunting country, reservation policy, political autonomy, bison-dependent lifeways, and federal expansion. Gold intensified those tensions. Treaty breakdown connected them. The ultimatum pushed them toward military confrontation. Little Bighorn became the most famous episode. It was not the whole war. Custer's immediate command was destroyed on June 25, 1876, but the conflict continued. Nor was the battle simply fought over a gold mine or mining camp. Federal pressure increased afterward. Some communities surrendered. Some lost horses and weapons. Dependence on federal rations grew. Then Washington applied another form of pressure. Congress tied future Sioux subsistence appropriations to surrender of the Black Hills and hunting rights. The Manypenny Commission arrived with terms already prepared. Some chiefs and leading men signed, but Article 12 of the 1868 treaty required approval from 3/4 of the adult male population occupying or interested in the reservation. Only about 10% signed the 1876 agreement. There were signatures. There were not enough to satisfy the treaty, so the Black Hills were not transferred through the consent procedure the United States had promised to follow. Congress acted another way. On February 28, 1877, legislation imposed the arrangement and removed the Black Hills from the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty threshold had not been met. The transfer was imposed by statute. More than a century later, the Supreme Court returned to that history. In United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians, the court upheld the finding that the 1877 action constituted a taking of tribal property requiring just compensation. The court did not order the Black Hills returned. The legal remedy was monetary. And that is why the final meaning of this history lies in the distance between promise and policy. The United States promised territorial protection. When gold made that protection increasingly inconvenient, unauthorized occupation expanded, enforcement weakened, negotiation failed, military and economic pressure followed, and when the required consent could not be obtained, Congress imposed the result through law. That is the deeper meaning behind the idea of the Black Hills Lie. It was not one false sentence, not one secret meeting, not one hidden order. It was the growing distance between what had been written and what the government ultimately chose to do. The Great Sioux War grew inside that distance, not from the Black Hills alone, but from a longer struggle over who controlled the land, who could move across it, who could hunt there, and how far federal power would extend across the West. Gold gave that struggle new urgency. The treaty gave it a measurable promise, and the years that followed showed how quickly such a promise could weaken when expansion pushed against it. By 1877, roads had carried miners inward. Military columns had crossed hunting country. Agency systems had drawn communities closer to federal control. Paper boundaries had changed. But beneath those changing claims, the same land remained. Pine-covered ridges, exposed stone, grassland at the forest edge, cool streams running through the hills. For Lakota communities, this had never been empty country waiting for gold to give it meaning. The hills had meaning before the treaty. They had meaning while the treaty stood, and they retained meaning after Congress changed the map. The documents show when the promise was made, how it weakened, and how the transfer was imposed. The later court record shows that the taking carried a legal debt, but the land itself provides the longer measure. As evening deepens, wind moves through the Ponderosa again. The roads, camps, military orders, battles, and arguments recede into history. The ridges remain, and with them remains the memory of a promise written across the American West, then broken when the land beneath it became too valuable for the government to leave protected.